Good evening and welcome to another edition of Arizona Wildlife Views. I'm your host, Ian Satter. You know, nothing's more exciting than being in the great outdoors and seeing wildlife roaming free. Tonight, we'll show you and your family the best places to view wildlife.
Being able to view wildlife in its natural habitat is one of life's great thrills, but knowing where and when you'll have the best chance can be tricky. The Pinetop Regional Office of the Arizona Game and Fish Department has created a new field guide. It's called White Mountains Wildlife Trails, and it'll help you map out a fun trip and enjoy nature in eastern Arizona.
The map was developed with a couple things in mind. We know that some people like to enjoy the outdoors by hiking and being up close to nature, yet other folks have some families and they would prefer to simply find some driving routes or driving loops to see wildlife from a vehicle. So the map is actually a combination of these two types of recreational activities. We've got over 20 different sites that are described in the map about where to go, what time is best to find wildlife.
The guide gives directions to local wildlife viewing spots and information about how to best navigate through them. Some sites have hiking trails, while others are driving loops of longer mileage. The guide also tells you what type of facilities are available at each location. In addition, the guide offers a comprehensive description of what types of animals you're likely to find in each spot, from elk to Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep to osprey and songbirds.
Several of the site descriptions actually occur on some of the department-owned wildlife areas that were acquired with heritage monies. For instance, one of our more recent ones is at the Grasslands White Mountain Wildlife Area. And just as the name describes, the majority of the habitat there is grassland habitat. It does have some pinyon juniper woodland that surrounds it. We do have a hiking trail that we just completed there that's about a little over 2.5 miles in length. The trail at Grasslands actually is laid out pretty neat. It follows the circumference of a large draw that has water in the bottom and some meadows. And as a person walks the trail, they can actually stay in cover for a good majority of the way as they circle this large draw. The draw itself, because of the water availability in the bottom, will attract large mammals such as pronghorn antelope. It has elk, some mule deer. It also has a wide variety of grassland birds. So it's a pretty neat little setup and something that we're real proud of. The trail itself is not very difficult. It does go up through a saddle of a low hill, so the hiking difficulty is actually moderate. One of my favorite areas to visit is the driving loop that we call the Wildcat Loop. It travels a large length of the Black River Canyon drainage. There are several points where you can drive out to short distances, or you can even park and walk to these overlooks where you can see the water itself. And as you're looking up and down the drainage, there are several interesting things to look for. If you arrive in early summer, there's probably going to be osprey sitting on nest with young in the nest. And the way the overlooks are situated, you would actually be above the nest itself, so you can see the young in the nest.
You can see one soaring and then there's one on the nest, so there's two hanging around on that second nest.
All right.
Getting a close-up view of wildlife can be a very rewarding experience, and the guide will help you do it in a way that doesn't disturb the animals you're trying to observe.
One of the points that the wildlife viewing guide makes is ethical viewing of wildlife, and that is observing wildlife from as much of a distance as you can so as not to interrupt their own behavior. Now, some of these places where you'll come to, you actually would need some optics to see wildlife better.
Yeah.
So a good pair of binoculars or even a spotting scope, a quality spotting scope, will help bring these animals up close to where you can actually see their behaviors. Most of that can't be done unless you're very, very close, and we don't want to get close because we don't want to disturb the animal's behavior.
Bruce Sitko and the staff of the Pinetop Regional Office know a lot about how to increase your chances for viewing wildlife.
There's a couple things to keep in mind whenever you're outdoors enjoying trying to find wildlife. first of all, you need to be out when the wildlife are most visible, when they're up and moving around, seeking food to eat or water to drink. Now, for large mammals, which the public seems to enjoy viewing quite a bit, those times are actually right at sunrise and they're right at sunset. Most animals don't move around very much in the middle of the day in the heat of the day. They like to get into cover where it's shady and kind of take it easy. The second tip that I could give to folks, if you don't do anything else in the woods, if you're taking hikes, the best thing to do is to move slowly and move quietly. We've all had these things happen to us where we're kind of talking a little bit, we're making a little bit too much noise, moving a little bit too fast, and all of a sudden we turn the corner of a hill or come around a bend in the trail just in time to see an animal that just dives out of sight. And all we see is the flash of its rear end or wings as they flutter off. And if we had just been a little bit quieter, we could have come upon that animal a little bit easier and not spooked it off. So move slowly and move quietly. Really take time to stop and look around and check your surroundings out.
The White Mountains Wildlife Trails map is available for free from any Arizona Game and Fish Department office.
One of the smaller critters in the forest is the Abert squirrel. And our next story, we'll join up with some Arizona Game and Fish researchers as they study this fascinating animal.
There are parts of Arizona where the trees grow tall and cover the surrounding terrain. These towering canopies are home to many different species of wildlife. We have several forests, and the vegetation varies depending on elevation, temperature, and water. Get out of the city, head out in any direction, and you can enjoy the land and all of its animal inhabitants. The conifer forests surrounding Flagstaff have a lot to offer their smaller critter residents, in particular this guy, the Abert squirrel. The Abert squirrel is 18 to 24 inches long, with a gray body, a reddish back, a white belly, and a dark tail with white sides. Their front forepaws are well adapted for life in the forest. The long, padded toes have sharp claws. They are very nimble and flexible. Long tufts of fur on the tops of their ears have given them a nickname, the tassel-eared squirrel. Sometimes they will perch motionless on a stump, sitting upright and surveying the surrounding terrain. But most of the time they are in motion, a running, bounding blur, flitting through the forest, rarely out of sight of a pine tree. In fact, their lives are totally dependent on the ponderosa pine tree, using it for food, shelter, and open space. Here's an Abert squirrel nibbling away on a forest treat, the juicy, sweet seeds hidden inside the scales of a pine cone. They nest in the trees, too, favoring a mass of intertwined twigs, infected by dwarf mistletoe. The branches of the trees serve as an elevated highway where they can speed around, jumping up to 7 or 8 feet between interlocking branches. Depending on the abundance of food sources, their territory can cover 6 to 24 acres. This dependency on the ponderosa pine tree also puts them at risk in the event of a forest fire, the kind of hot, blazing fire that burns up the high boughs of the pine trees. After a fire of this magnitude, the trees are stripped of their interlocking canopy, leaving little opportunity for the Abert squirrel to find food or shelter. Fire, though, is a natural part of a forest life cycle and can be expected to happen. In the forest just north of Flagstaff, steps are being taken to avoid a big, hot forest fire like the ones we've seen recently in other parts of the state. The Forest Service and other land managers are implementing fuel reduction treatments, a policy which includes thinning or cutting out some trees and prescribed burns. The goal is to protect homes from fire in forested areas. The Arizona Game and Fish Department is interested in the effects on wildlife resulting from these treatments. Catherine Whiteman is a researcher for Game and Fish.
There's been a big push to reduce the fuels around communities. We're really concerned about communities burning up in catastrophic wildfire. And so the Forest Service is going to be doing a lot of thinning and fuels reduction treatments in the wildland-urban interface, so in those areas right around Flagstaff. And we believe that we can protect communities and still maintain habitat for wildlife.
Part of this forest management plan prescribes small, smoldering fires to be purposely set among the pine needles and debris covering the forest floor. The idea is to burn a little now, clearing away some of the dry brush. The fire stays low, avoiding the upper reaches of the trees where the Abert squirrel lives. In other areas, the tree canopy will be opened up, allowing more sunlight to get through, promoting the production of grasses, forbs, and pine cones. The overall goal is to create what's called a mosaic effect, some dense canopy and some open spaces, some burned areas and other areas untouched.
We're concerned that we're going to be reducing a lot of the squirrel habitat. And so in this area, we're hoping to be able to put on the ground a mosaic prescription that squirrels really seem to respond to, and that's patches of that really dense canopy forest and then patches that are more open.
Now, to see just how this forest management process affects the Abert squirrel, a primary inhabitant of the ponderosa pine, Game and Fish biologists Catherine Whiteman and Fenner Yarborough are conducting research.
We're at Fort Valley in Flagstaff. We're setting traps. We have 160 traps, so we're baiting them with peanuts, opening them early this morning, and going to leave them open all day, and then come back about 5:30 or 6 tonight and check them and see if there's any squirrels in there.
The research methodology involves trapping squirrels and then fitting them with these technical marvels. A small locator beacon that fits around the squirrel's neck. Researchers can track the squirrel's movements with these receiver antennas. Norris Dodd with the Arizona Game and Fish Department has been trapping squirrels for a long time and explains the process.
It's a 12-line grid, 12 traps on each line, so we end up with 144 traps, spaced about 70 meters apart. The whole area is about 150 acres. And because I have to have a crew of trappers walking the lines, we need to make sure that it's something they can follow without getting lost. Everything is established on a compass line, and we use this hip chain to go ahead and measure accurately between the different trap lines.
Norris conducted his studies on squirrels in the mid-1990s. The ongoing drought is believed to have affected their population. There just doesn't seem to be as many these days as there were 10 years ago.
You had squirrel densities that were 3 or 4 times higher than what we've found so far. We're really hoping that we've had about 18 months of pretty decent wet weather, and so we're hoping that the squirrel population will respond to that. And we'll see next spring, if in fact it did.
The traps are simple spring-loaded devices that do not harm the squirrels. Each morning, Catherine and Fenner load up with a bucket full of peanuts and walk the trap lines, baiting their prey.
We got peanuts in the bucket that we use for baiting. We try to put a handful in the back of the trap, and then some around the front, and a little bit a trail going in to hopefully entice them into the trap.
Each trap is partially covered with sticks to provide some cover for the animal inside.
Even though we do put some shade, I think the high temperature today is supposed to be 58, so they won't overheat or get too cold during the day or anything like that.
Then, later in the afternoon, Catherine and Fenner return to check the traps. Empty traps are sprung so that an animal will not get caught overnight.
It gets cold enough in Flagstaff that we can't leave them open overnight. So we check them as close to dark as we can and close them at night to make sure nothing gets in there until morning, and then we'll come back out and set them again.
It's simply a matter of walking from one trap to the next, looking inside for an animal, and if there is none, using a long pole to flip the trap mechanism. You get your exercise with this type of work.
These traps are 50 meters apart, and we have 4 grids in 2 different sites, so we pretty much walk about 6 miles a day lugging around buckets of peanuts, and most of the time we end up working at night, so we're trying to find tiny little pin flags in dark with flashlights. So it is tougher work than most people think.
Trap after trap is empty. It's not that easy to catch a squirrel. Researchers have to be very diligent to get a sample size large enough to make the study relevant.
We're just going to keep trapping and keep seeing what we can do, and maybe they'll get used to the traps a little more and start going in them, and we'll just keep plugging away and hopefully we'll have better luck.
Finally, we walk upon a trap with a small furry rodent inside. But it's the wrong kind of squirrel for this study. This is a common ground squirrel, not the Aberts.
Okay, no biting.
The trap door is open.
Go on, free, you're free.
And he runs away. Other traps yield stellar jays.
Go on.
Then, one trap has captured an Abert squirrel. He has to be anesthetized before the radio collar can be attached. This is done by placing the entire trap inside a bag, then adding a pouch filled with knockout drugs to put him to sleep. These are the same drugs your vet uses on your pet. Once he's out, researchers have to work fast, attaching the collar. Loose enough so that it doesn't restrict movement, but tight enough not to fall off. Then, after a brief recovery period, he's released back into the wild. Now his habits can be tracked with the radio equipment. Researchers are hoping to learn more about the squirrel's movements after the forest has been treated. For example, will the squirrels move out of the treated areas, or will they stay and just use the untreated areas? How do they utilize the new space created when fire clears out brush and debris? This data will be tracked over time and be compared to squirrels in areas where no treatment has been done. It will make it possible for researchers to better understand the Abert squirrel.
Around here in Flagstaff, they're being really proactive with prescribed fires and that type of thing, so we really want to monitor squirrel populations and other wildlife populations to see the effect of prescribed burns on the animals.
Forest fires are a fact of life. As people move and build homes near wooded areas, the pressure to protect these homes from wildfires increases. Researchers like Catherine and Fenner are looking for a balance between protecting houses from fire and maintaining habitat for wildlife.
And now for a study in contrast. We leave the cool conifers of northern Arizona and travel to the Sonoran Desert outside of Yuma for a look at another small but interesting creature, the flat-tailed horned lizard.
The flat-tailed horned lizards are part of a larger group of lizards called horned lizards.
There's different names in different parts of the country for them: horned frogs, horned toads, horned lizards. Horned lizards are fairly small lizards, maybe 5-6 inches long in total length. They have scales, which identifies them as reptiles. They're very flat-bodied and wide compared to other lizards, and unique in that way. The thing that brings us back to the idea of calling them horny toads is they have kind of fat bodies, and they're very sedentary. They don't run around a lot. Within their broad range, there's 13-14 species, and they occur from southern Canada. They're the northernmost distributed lizard in their family, all the way down to the border of Guatemala and southern Mexico. Some of those species have a fairly broad range. In contrast to that, there are some species that have very narrow ranges.
The flat-tailed horned lizard is distributed in a very narrow range compared to other horned lizard species. It is found within the lower Colorado River subdivision of the Sonoran Desert. And this just basically is the southwestern corner of Arizona and the southeastern corner of California. Its range does extend down into Mexico in some of the dunes that are to the east of the Gulf of California. If you were walking through the desert, you would be lucky to see a flat-tailed horned lizard. It takes many, many man-hours, even if you're looking for flat-tailed horned lizards, to find a single lizard.
Flat-tails have long, thin horns, fringed scales on each side of their bodies, and a dark line down the middle of their back. Their bodies are about 2 to 4 inches long.
If you were to see a flat-tailed horned lizard, it would be nearly indistinguishable in color from the sandy surface or the surface on which you would find it, because they're so cryptically colored. It's fairly likely that it would be sitting still, because they frequently freeze when they're approached by people on foot, and it makes it even harder to see. Something else that they do, both to escape the heat and also just probably to hide, is they can throw a little bit of sand up on their backs, and it makes it even harder to see them. You may just see the horns sticking up, or some other portion of the species' head or body.
There are many, many species of ants that are out here in the desert that flat-tails may eat, but by and large they prefer to eat what we call harvester ants. These are fairly large ants. When eating these ants, they have to process all of these hard parts, the legs, the antennas, the shells, so they have a whole lot of hard parts that have to come through this small animal's digestive system. When you pick up an ant scat and look at it, it looks like a little black egg, and then when you break it apart, all it is are these ant parts. It's all ant heads, ant legs, ant antennas, and various parts of the shells.
Flat-tailed horned lizards face a variety of natural threats in the desert, such as birds, snakes, other lizards, and mammals. Yet the greatest threat to the flat-tailed horned lizard is humans. These and other negative impacts have contributed to a loss of flat-tailed horned lizard habitat. Biologists have been studying these fascinating animals for many years to help inform our decisions about how to protect flat-tailed horned lizards.
There's been considerable concern over the status of the flat-tailed horned lizard since the 70s, when surveys first started for this species. They were difficult to find, as they still are today, but in addition, there has been visible loss of habitat occurring in some portions of the species range. The concern for the species remains high, both within the Fish and Wildlife Service and within the sister agencies that manage the lands on which the species largely occurs. There's a group of approximately 10 agencies that signed a conservation agreement in 1997 to protect flat-tailed horned lizards on the lands that they manage.
Since then, management areas have been established. Off-highway vehicles have been restricted from activity in the management areas. Funds collected from unavoidable negative impacts to flat-tailed horned lizard habitat are used to acquire good habitat elsewhere. Research and range-wide surveys have been conducted, and the agreement is guiding management, research, monitoring, and regulation for the flat-tailed horned lizard. As the agency's work continues, there are a few simple things we can all do to protect the flat-tailed horned lizard. If you're driving or recreating in the desert, stay on existing roadways or designated OHV areas. Animals may be injured or killed by vehicles. Plants grow slowly here. This creosote bush may look small, but it may be over 100 years old. Creosotes may spread by cloning themselves, and a creosote clone in the Yuma Desert was recently aged at 18,000 years old, making it by far the oldest living thing known on Earth. Don't touch, capture, or keep flat-tailed horned lizards as pets. Alterations in the desert rob flat-tails of their homes. When you buy or build a home, look for those with small yards and those that use native vegetation for landscaping. Whether you're a native of the Southwest, a new resident, or a visitor, all agree that the desert is a place of special beauty and mystery. The more we understand about the desert, the closer we look, the more we discover that these arid lands are fragile and full of life. These are your neighbors too. They're part of the desert world. and you can help to make sure that their world is never lost.
Well, that's our show for tonight. If you'd like any information on anything you've seen here, please visit our website at azgfd.gov. For producers Carol Lind and Gary Schaefer, I'm your host, Ian Satter. We'll see you next time.